At times I worry the discussion about foreign policy misses the fact that yes, we want to defend ourselves, but we have to remember it is a democratic republic that we are defending. It's a free society, that we have to ensure that our mode of defense for our society doesn't undercut the very values that make our society so important and so such a place to live. During the Cold War, foreign policy was easy. More or less from 1945 to 1989. You can argue about exactly when the Cold War started and exactly when it ended. Nevertheless, foreign policy was relatively easy. Ronald Reagan, I think, correctly referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. It certainly was evil. Tens of millions of people perished. Tens of millions of people went through the Gulag. And this is a country that expanded its power into Eastern Europe, was threatening, was worrisome, at times allied with, at times not quite so allied with Maoist China, but nevertheless, you look around the world, from an American standpoint, from a European standpoint, there was that sense of a central puppeteer that the US had to deal with. You had local and regional threats, everything was tied back to a potential hegemonic threat. And foreign policy, for the most part, was focused on that. You had a set of alliances, you had forced bases around the world, you had forces around the world, you had a large military, far larger military during kind of nominal peacetime that we had ever had before. Previously, we would ramp up Civil War, World War I, and then ramp down. Basically, after World War II, while the force came down from the 13 million men who were under arms to fight the Nazis and the Japanese, we still had a much larger military than traditional in our history. So the question then is, when the Soviet Union disappears, when the evil empire disappears, now what do you do? And there were a lot of attempts to come up with something kind of to replace that, and we're kind of in that today. If you read some of the analyses, people talk about the great dangers in the world, but quite honestly, there are dangers in the world, but none of them are the same as a Soviet Union with nuclear missiles, which we could imagine a nuclear exchange. None of them equate with the Red Army that could take over Western Europe. None of them equate with the Red Navy floating around the Pacific. What we face today is a very different kind of world than we faced during the Cold War. And it's important as we think about foreign policies to remember the costs of foreign policy. In Washington, as Tom referred to the district of corruption, this is a very incestuous place and it revolves around power. And quite frankly, if you want to be involved in the process, it's very rewarding to want an expansive American role. You want to go to conferences in Europe. You don't go to conferences in Europe by suggesting the Europeans should defend themselves. I've written a lot on Korea, and the South Koreans, for some very strange reason, have not been impressed when I've suggested maybe they should spend more on their own defense. As they've told me, they have other needs to take care of. They much prefer to have us to take care of them. This is a city that kind of rewards that kind of engagement, especially if you happen to be in power. Compare the Secretary of State of the United States to being the foreign minister of, Italy. Who gets better treated? Who can wander around the world telling the rest of the world what they think and what they should do? The foreign minister of Italy, as far as I can tell, doesn't have much to do. Secretary of State is very busy wandering the world trying to bring peace and settlements and instructing the rest of the world. So this is a city that kind of really emphasizes the notion that expansive foreign policy is a very good thing. But it's important to think about what the costs of foreign policy are, that kind of an expansive foreign policy does not come cheap. The first is a military budget. I think we have to view the defense budget, or I think more accurately, the military budget, as the price of your foreign policy. The worst thing you can do is have an expansive foreign policy and not have the force structure to back it up. If you're going to put people into uniform, they have to have the force, they have to have the numbers, they have to have the equipment to do what you want them to do. The more you want them to do, the more you have to spend. The US today spends around $700 billion on the military. If you look at, compare it to the rest of the world, we're something like 45% of the rest of the world. Dramatic numbers. And that is primarily because most of our military is focused on offense, that is projection of power, not defense. We demonstrated on 9/11 we weren't very good, actually, at defending the homeland. Indeed, despite the fact we had a Department of Defense, they came up with the Department of Homeland Security, which is viewed as separate from the Department of Defense. Much of what our Department of Defense does is actually defends other countries. It's not clear that, in fact, defending other countries is necessarily the same as defending the US. So your foreign policy is going to determine how much you want to spend. And I worry today much of the talk about defense budget is being driven by budget concerns. They matter, but you want to start with foreign policy. You don't want to just cut your defense budget and keep your foreign policy, because then you're out of whack and you endanger your personnel. The second is the risk of war. The reality is war happens. We view kind of get around the world, we can deter conflict, but the world, world history is filled with the failure of deterrence. World War I, World War II, there were alliance structures, there were threats to defend, they failed. World War I demonstrated how alliances basically become a transmission belt of war. The moment you start the process, the Archduke is murdered on June 28, 1914 in Serbia. And what happens, lo and behold, by a couple months later, all of Europe is involved in war. The US and Japan eventually get in because of an assassination in kind of a distant part of the Balkans. The alliance structure did that. And we see that today. What happens in Taiwan? Are we committed to defending Taiwan? Back in 2008, Georgia, the country, wanted to get into NATO, pushed very hard for American support, started a war in that region with Russians, not very smart, and they hoped for American intervention. Apparently it did go to the cabinet, and to my mind, thankfully, the Bush administration decided it wasn't worth a war with Russia to defend Georgia. But if you set tripwires around the world, you look at Korea, traditionally our forces along the DMZ in Korea are viewed as a tripwire. That is to ensure automatic involvement if there's a conflict. So if you're going to set out these kind of alliances and forces, you have to recognize you might end up at war. And virtually never do people expect to end up in the wars they end up in. Third, of course, is the loss of life. Part of that is military, 4,500 dead in Iraq, for example. And the good news there was far more of our military personnel survived because of better medical care. Back in Vietnam, a much higher percentage of casualties died. But today, many of the people who've been wounded have grievous wounds that will follow them for the rest of their lives. In terms of IEDs, explosive devices, loss of limbs, the mental injuries, these are people who will be suffering from those injuries for the rest of their lives. Moreover, war is not a very friendly place for other people either. In Iraq, which many people view as a humanitarian exercise, probably the best estimate is that about 200,000 civilians died in that conflict. Now, we didn't kill them, but we blew the place up. And lo and behold, the carnage that then happened, we were there. And then what? Half the Christian community was pushed out of the country, many of them actually into Syria. They're scared to death about what's going to happen in that country. 2 to 3 million people internally displaced or forced abroad as refugees, a country ravaged by crime and other things. War is not a very good humanitarian tool. And we should take that cost into account when we start thinking about the kind of foreign policy we're going to be engaged in. There's an extraordinary burden on military personnel. We've seen over the last decade or so when you turn American soldiers basically into occupiers, you turn them into, they're supposed to be mayors and counselors and policemen and everything else. You have them long-term trying to rebuild societies. We've turned our reservists basically into substitutes, not just complements in an emergency, but with great regularity, calling them up. We pull them out of their jobs. We disrupt their families. So it's a very real burden. It has an impact on recruiting if you want to maintain your force over the long term. Kind of interventionist foreign policy has to affect your domestic liberties. Randolph Bourne once said, war is the health of the state. The point is, the more you get involved in these things, we find, for example, NSA, the recent disclosures, the pervasiveness of surveillance, many of the parts of the Patriot Act, the ability of the government to find out what we're doing without warrants, without effective oversight. This president claims that he basically can kill on his own order. The New York Times did this story. They all kind of sit around and do video. They bring down screens, and pictures of people, and does the president, kind of like the Roman Colosseum, does this or this if somebody gets offed. President Bush said he could arrest an American citizen on American soil and hold them incommunicado. The pressure of this kind of involvement, automatically puts pressure on domestic liberties.